So in the past three videos that I've released, I sort of jumped about and didn't really plan anything. And I feel like in this episode, I'm going to sort of do a review of everything I've covered, but just in a bit more of a structured format. And I'm going to limit it to 10 minutes. So here we go. Informal introduction to Python. I'm referring to the documentation as we go, and the reason for that is that I want this to kind of be the plain structure, but also to teach you that you can sort of follow documentation as you sort of go on your own learning journey. And the first thing they talk about here is the interpreter. So input and output are distinguished by the presence and absence of prompts. So these two. And to repeat the example, you must type everything after the prompt when the prompt appears. Lines that do not begin with a prompt are output from the interpreter. So what does that actually mean? So do you see here, I've got the interpreter open, and you've got sort of these three symbols as you do here, right? That is the beginning of an input. So if I do print, let me zoom in. So if I do print hello, right, it returns hello. And here, this is the input, right? And this is the output. So because there's nothing here, you can view that as the output, and that's how you know. And that's one thing that's really good about the interpreter. You get instant results when you write something. If you're using like an IDE like VS Code or Vim, then you will have to run the Python file, and C compiles it in the background and then prints it out on the terminal or wherever you are sending the message or the output to. But in the interpreter, you can sort of do it on the fly, and that's really good for things like testing and experimenting, etc. So that's kind of the first thing. The second one, right, is the three dots. That's usually when you're doing a multi-line command. So if true print hello world, and do you see how what I did here? The first input is this, and because I wrote a piece of code that can only be valid if another line is implemented, i.e. an if statement followed by a colon, Python's lexical structure, like the tokens, views this colon as like an indication that an indentation is required. And so an indentation happens automatically, and from an interpreter standpoint, it turns into three dots. So summary is that when writing an input, these three symbols appear, and if you're doing multi-line commands, then anything that follows the initial input symbol gets followed by these until you reach a blank space, and when you press enter again with nothing typed in this final kind of multi-line entry, Python then views that or takes that as a sign that you are done with this multi-line command, and then it will execute whatever you've written. So just to kind of hammer that point home, if I then follow up with print goodbye, and then enter twice because it entered to go to the next line, but then because I've written nothing there, I'm pressing enter again and telling Python that the whole thing's over, then it kind of prints everything that is included in this multi-line section. So I could write whatever I want here, and as long as I don't press enter on an empty line, it will continue giving me new lines. And that is how you can write some pretty complex stuff using just the interpreter, which if you can get used to doing and you prioritize doing this over using an IDE, that's kind of better in my opinion. I actually personally only use Vim. I use Vim as opposed to VS Code. I only use VS Code at work, and if I'm doing something like really complex, like a massive project that requires flicking between multiple files, and even then you can use NeoVim instead of Vim, which actually supports that. So, but you know, without digressing too much, because I digressed a lot in my previous videos, I'm trying to do that less. Basically, you try and use the interpreter when you can, and you'll learn a lot more that way. So yeah. This is just kind of guides on how to follow the tutorial. Read this if you want to go through it in your own time. One thing I'd like to cover is comments. So a comment is always prefixed with a hash. So when I write this, right, then I can do whatever I want, and Python will do nothing. Because it won't see that as a valid line of code. It will see it as a comment. If I do the same thing but remove the hash, Python will try to interpret this piece of code. It's not going to understand what you're telling it, and it's going to cry about it. In fact, it actually thinks I'm going to write a new line. So what's that all about? What the hell? Did I do something by accident? Did I do like a special character or something? Let me do this. Yeah, there we go. So do you see how it starts to cry? It says, you know, name error. This is not defined. Now, funnily enough, I'm not going to go too much. I'll cover errors in another video, but Python basically thinks that you're trying to call a variable, and you're not calling a variable because that variable doesn't exist. If I were to do this, and then this, and then this, right? So assigning that random piece of gibberish, but telling Python that I'm assigning the value 1 to that variable, and then I do this, it's going to return 1 because that's the value that I've assigned to this, and therefore it kind of joins the Python ecosystem or the memory allocation within your sort of Python interpreter. But if I do like another random piece of code, it's not going to understand that variable, that what it thinks is a variable, and therefore it's going to sort of cause an error. But then if I do a hash, then it's a comment and nothing happens because it's a comment. Now, why would you want comments? Well, because you know, you write a lot of complex stuff in Python, and not only that, but you're also going to be working with a team and with loads of other people, and they're going to need to understand your code. And so annotating your code is very, very crucial. So if I do, you know, reading file, and then print reading file, and then, you know, here, if I then send this to like someone else, maybe my boss or something, and let's say this is like some complex piece of code, I just wrote print reading file here just to kind of make it really simple. But let's say you've got like a bunch of stuff, you have to connect to this API, and you have to write this pipeline, and you have to do all gibberish, all sorts of gibberish, but you preface it with this comment saying reading file, then your boss, who may not be like a Python whiz but understands a bit of code, will look at that, see it as a comment, and then say, okay, all of this bullshit is, oh sorry, all of this stuff is basically just you reading a file. So yeah, that's some examples here. And because we're almost coming up to 10 minutes, rather than moving into numbers, I'm actually just going to stick with this. So if I wrap a piece of text in a string, I just gave it away. If I wrap some numbers in or some letters in these exclamation marks, Python actually views that as a string value. Whereas if I were to do the same thing and not have that, then you know what's going to happen. It's not going to understand and it's going to cry. But if I wrap it in quotation marks, then it views that as a string and that gets interpreted as valid. If I then, within the strings, preface it with a hashtag and then print that, even though I prefaced it with a hashtag, Python still sees that as a string because the entire thing is wrapped in quotation marks. And then if I remove those and then print, it's not going to throw an error, but that's not going to hold any value because it's a comment. We're almost at 9 minutes. One more thing I'd like to show you. 3 exclamation marks, enter, gives you a multi-line statement, and then hi, please see attached, regards, Eamon, and then end it in 3 exclamation marks, and then press enter, and you will see it actually saves that as a sort of comment. It's a string value, but it's also referred to in the Python community as Docstrings, and it's an alternative way of doing comments because these hashtags are like all well and good, but it's one line. So if you wanted to write a multi-line comment, let's say like an in-depth explanation of what this method or this class does, for instance, you would have to do the purpose of this function, and then because you've reached the end of the line, you then have to do enter and then do it again, is to blah blah blah, right? That is going to be tedious to do, to like prefix each line with a hashtag. So that's where this multi-line docstrings can be useful as an alternative to using comments. You can write, the purpose of this function, is to call the OpenAI endpoint and make inferences using the Metropolitan Police Crime Monitor API as input data, and then enter. And then when you enter it, it does return this string. But if you're in like VS Code or Vim or wherever, and you put that multi-line docstring in the file, Python's just gonna kind of coast right through that piece of text, because it will view it as a comment, and it can be used to sort of annotate and pepper your code with like details that can be readable to the human eye. So that is the very basics. To summarize, I've covered, if I scroll all the way to the top, I've covered basic print statements, input, multi-line, how indentation is automatically applied when you're doing sort of if statements. You can ignore those, but then you'll receive an error, indentation error. We've covered comments, we've covered variables assignments, and we've covered like the name error very briefly, where if you write a piece of text without wrapping it in quotation marks and you try and run that code, Python's going to think it's a variable, and then it's going to throw an error because that variable doesn't exist. But then if you take that same gibberish and you apply it to, if you apply a real value to that piece of text, then it will see it as a variable, and then therefore it will work from then on. And then what else did we cover? Yeah, we covered what you could do if you wanted to write sort of multi-line comments. You may be wondering, what are these, right? Because I wrote this, but then it's coming out in this way, which is really weird. Now, for those of you who are intelligent, you can probably sort of figure this out, but just to sort of really dumb it out, because some intelligent people may simply just not understand the concept of special characters, so not your fault. These are basically special characters. I'll cover these in more detail in sort of future videos where I delve into strings very deeply. I did cover this in my 3 videos, but they were like an hour long, so yeah. But yeah, no, so I hope that this makes sense. This is kind of people who are sort of starting out with Python, having never done it before. I did cover these before, like I said, but I'm really just trying to make shorter videos and do like more bite-sized content and stuff. So yeah, hope you enjoyed. Alright, bye.